Hi folks, welcome to this video, another history one. This is on the 20th century development of sport. One thing I just want to say before I start putting things on the screen is you've got to be aware that this is the only era in the historical section where it's a full century. So it's very unlikely, and it didn't happen, that things stay the same for 100 years. So this is the most progressive, most expansive era that we'll look at in terms of the historical development of sport. Again, I'll try and do it section by section and explain a few things that took place throughout this century. Okay, so let's deal with class first. So class, we still have today, a three-class system. We've got the upper classes, the middle classes, and the lower working classes, however you want to term them. So in terms of this century, the upper classes are still very, very big on amateurism, amateur ideals. No pay, you play for the love of the sport, you play for honour, respect, etc., etc. As a result, your upper classes do sports such as rowing, athletics, golf, rugby union. Athletics in the 20th century is amateur. You cannot get paid. I think I'm right in saying Lord Sebastian Coe won gold medals in 1980 and 1984 Olympics. The guy who brought the 2012 games to London, he was nearly banned because he wrote a book about his life in athletics, and that was deemed to be him trying to be a professional, trying to earn money off the back of his sporting career. So it was that tight, it was that strict. So the upper classes, very big on amateurism, and they play sports that have very big amateur ideals. The middle classes are exactly the same, very, similar to upper classes. Both these sectors have more time, more money, so they could participate in sport that had amateur ideals. In contrast to that, the lower classes, your working classes, they are very big on professionalism right now. Remember, they've got very little time, very little money. So if they can play sports where they can get some kind of payment for it, that is going to be massively beneficial to them. When I talk about professionalism in this century, I am not talking about millionaires, far from it. I'm talking about earning a very small amount of money from playing regularly in sport. So we're talking about football, and we're talking about rugby league in particular. So in terms of law and order then, the next one, the vast majority of your cruel sports, your blood sports have now gone. However, hunting and shooting still taking place. Now, these are upper class activities showing that the people making the laws at this time are still upper class, rich, gentry, people that ban in all blood sports. Society is much more calm and tolerant and peaceful and happy. However, we're going to keep some of our sports for ourselves. So there is still some of that going on. However, what does happen in this century for a lot of sports is we have fixed numbers, boundaries, time limits. That's been put in place, since the public school boys started rationalising sport. However, it really gets ramped up this century because media coverage is increasing. I'm going to come on to that in a couple of minutes. The radio really starts to become big in the 1940s. Newspapers have always been big and continue to be big. But in this century as well, TV comes in, particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s. So as media coverage increases, there is a greater need for fair play. People want to watch and listen to sport that is fair, that is where both teams, all performers, are being treated equally. So that has a big impact. Media has a big influence on the rules. Also in this century, we've got the First and the Second World War. First World War, 1914 to 1918. Second World War, 1939 until 1945. Now, sport is seen as an escape from the horrors of war, chance to just take your brains off bombings and shootings and killings and family members being killed and things like that. As a result of that, and as a result of many other things, spectator levels increase. You go to watch more live sport, you listen to more sport, you read about more sport, and sport is therefore seen as being respectable. And it has good behaviour associated with it, not just the players, but the spectators as well. However, towards the end of this century, we start to see a rise in hooliganism, particularly lower class males in sports like football. Now, there's various reasons surrounding that, but it unfortunately just comes down to those things were happening at the times, and people were getting away with it, and there really wasn't a big police presence to try and get rid of it. But obviously that's changed, and the law and order has changed massively to try and deal with those incidents. Now, on to education. Two crucial things to tell you about this. Obviously, lots of things happen in 100 years, but we can't write them all down. But the main two in 1944, the Butler Act comes in. And the Butler Act was about, setting standards of what can be expected in education in the UK and what each school should try to do with its students. Now, the Butler Act, I've just cut the phrase down, made particular reference to the physical developments of the community. So every educational establishment, school has or must provide for physical development of the community. So this is the first time in education in this country there has been specific reference to making people fitter, healthier, physically more active. So that is a really, really crucial development to take place in this century. The second thing comes a fair few years later, which is in 1988, when the national curriculum is really developed. And the national curriculum, for those who don't know, was brought in so that no matter where you are in this country, you are going to get taught the same things as everybody else. You're going to have the same access to the same standard of education as everybody else. So that's what the national curriculum is all about. It's making sure that you get taught the same no matter where you are in the country. And when that came in, PE was one of the key subjects. So PE, physical education. So in other words, no matter where you are in the country, in the UK, you must do PE. And within PE, you must do a set range of sports and activities. So they're the two real crucial developments in terms of education in this century, allowing for people to do more kind of sport, more kind of physical activity. Now, in terms of gender, surprise, surprise, apologies, ladies, it's still male dominated. Now, that's in terms of participation and spectating. So men are still playing most of the sport and are watching most of the sport. Now, why is that? Because we still in this century have this view as females being the housewife and the mother. And if you adopt those roles, there is no 9 to 5 of being a housewife and a mother. It's an all-day 24/7 job. As a result of that, females for a large part of this century still have little time and little money to participate in sport. And, they're viewed as the weaker sex. And sport is stereotypically masculine. It requires, muscle power. It requires physical attributes, and women don't have that according to that stereotype, which is all a load of rubbish. But unfortunately, that's the way it was. Now, what compounds that, what makes it even worse, is there are fewer opportunities due to less media coverage. Remember, we still have far from equal media coverage of women's and men's sport on TV now in the 21st century. So imagine what it was like in the 20th century. Also, there are fewer events for women to compete at the Olympics, and it links to this stereotypical view, a masculine view. Women were not allowed to triple jump until I think it was the early part of this century, late part of the 20th century, because it was viewed that women didn't have the joints and muscles were not strong enough to do a triple jump. Same with pole vaulting. They were not allowed to pole vault because they weren't strong enough to do it. They weren't allowed to do a marathon because a woman would collapse and die doing a marathon. Now, these are viewpoints that are only 30 or 40 years old, believe it or not. So it really is staggering. But that just compounds the problem and reinforces the stereotype that we've got. However, some sports are acceptable. So gymnastics, tennis, athletics. Think about it. We don't bat an eyelid when there is when Wimbledon's on TV. There is equal coverage of men's and women's tennis matches. That's because there always has been equal coverage of women's and men's tennis matches. Same with athletics. I dare say same with swimming. We don't view them as separately. We view them as the same standard of sport and entertainment. But if you watch women's football, there is still that view that it's not as good as men's football. And again, it's that stereotyping that comes in. And then in terms of income, money that you're bringing in, obviously that still has a massive impact on your participation spectating in sports. If you are lower class, linking back to the first thing we did in this little video, you're earning more money in this century than you've ever done before, but you're still working long and hard for actually quite little money. So you play in spectating professional sports, football, rugby league, because there's a chance for you to maybe earn a little bit more if you become a good player in that sport. So you go and watch it as well because it's aspirational, it's escapism. That could be me one day, particularly if you're on the young side of things. You're also, if you're lower class, you play a lot of the pub sports as well. The pub is the epicenter of your sporting world in this 20th century. So darts, snooker, things like that. Again, you can become quite good at these sports. you can start to earn a bit of a living off the back of it and being successful in the sports. In terms of upper class and middle class, you have got a lot of wealth, and therefore you can afford to do the sports that have big amateur tags to them. So amateur sports and ideals, more disposable income. That's absolutely huge and massive. Rugby union, don't forget, rugby union, I think, was amateur until 1995. And I think I'm right in saying that it's something like 88% of all England rugby union international players, still to this day, are public school educated. So still, rugby union has this big, even though it's professional now, has still this big middle class, upper class tag associated with it, because it's the amateur ideals that have run the sport for 150 years. Okay, so income obviously massively linked to class. Now, in terms of time throughout this century, as this century goes on, there's a gradual increase in leisure time for all sectors of society as this century progresses, particularly for working classes. Laws start to come in surrounding the working week and how many hours someone should actually work, in order to keep them safe and healthy and things like that. As a result, sectors of society have got more time to participate and spectate. However, the upper class and the middle classes still have the most time and they have the most disposable income because of their wealth, and the lower classes still have the least time. So, nothing really radical there. Things are improving. But remember, this is a full century. You've gone from in the early 1900s still working very, very long weeks, to in the 1990s working much shorter weeks, but it's still the lower classes that are still working the longer hours generally. So then finally, transport. Now, throughout 100 years, you can expect a lot of things to change. Now, you've got a big, massive increase in rail transport, buses, and car ownership. But again, car ownership is coming towards the end of the 20th century. That's when that really starts to expand. Now, these initially rails, trains and buses were developed, to transport products, materials from the Industrial Revolution onwards, but they can also transport people, so participants and spectators. And as car ownership increases, again, you can increase the number of participants and spectators as well. Aeroplanes are becoming more and more common in this century. However, nothing like what it is in the 21st century. You've got no budget airlines. So the airlines are still, and aeroplanes are still reserved for the upper classes and the middle classes who want to go maybe watch an Olympics over somewhere else in Europe, or travel to see England playing a World Cup. So it's very, air travel is still very much reserved for the upper class and the middle classes during this century. Now, the media grew in this century, as we've already mentioned, radio from the 1940s onwards, TV from the 1960s onwards. Now, this encourages live TV audiences to watch, which then encourages large live audiences. You want to go see it for yourself, and if there's more buses, there's more trains, there's more car ownership, we can actually go. So the TV has got you hooked on this sport in the first place, but now as transport increases, I can now go watch this live myself. So those two marry in quite well together. So they're all the factors, the socio-contemporary factors that influence sport. And remember, this is the biggie. This is a big century, and a lot happens in 100 years. So don't try and just say this happened. Things generally progress over 100 years. The other four time areas that you look at are much shorter in comparison to this one. So this has got the most scope to expand your answer and bring a few examples in. Hope you found this video useful, folks.